One of the reasons for the transition from traditional to modern art was the development of photography. The technical understanding about how chemical compounds react to light. Two men made advancements in photography, Louis Daguerre and Nicephore Niépce. Around 1829, they teamed up to capture an image on a chemical plate. By the early 19th century, artists had become quite good at using paint to represent or represent objects. In this case, we're looking at a still life. Still life takes everyday household objects, right? Nothing special, and then tries to create or recreate the beauty of the objects, how light interacts with the objects themselves, and then the composition of them. So here we see a kitchen scene. On one side, there are lemons and apples, and then over in the middle, there are dead birds. On the bottom, some root vegetables, celery. There's no religious significance to this. There's no, quote, long-term value in this. It's a pretty picture. And the artist who created it did something that is quite extraordinary. If you've ever tried to realistically capture an object like this with paint, it's difficult. It's not something that most people can do. But a still life painter could make a pretty good living painting these and selling them. But then all of a sudden comes along this photography. And photographers were able to capture still life in a way that paintings couldn't, because they could accurately represent a scene. Well, at least in black and white, right? There's still no color here. But still, right, they're continuing this idea of composition, the play of light and darkness, all create something that is pleasing to the eye. And so gradually, over the course of the 19th century, and particularly later part of the 19th century, photography starts pushing still life painting out of the area of elite painters. That's no longer interesting them. They're going to go off in a different direction. Photographers could also then capture landscape scenes. So, for example, this is one of the first photographs of Paris in 1838. Photographers at this time needed stills, couldn't have people moving around. It would mess up because of exposure, would mess up the painting. Later on, this enters into the realm of photojournalism, where a photographer could present an accurate portrayal of a scene, or at least a relatively accurate portrayal of a scene. So, for example, this is a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Instead of having portraits done by a painter, portraits were still done by a painter, but more and more portraits were then captured by photographers. So much so that we've got this little thing we call a selfie today, where everybody can even take a picture of themselves. But in the course of the 19th century, we have more images of average people than we have in any other time in human history. And it's that technological advance in photography that allows us to literally see into the past. But obviously, this is stage, right? It's not moving. He's got to sit there for quite a while. He's got his fancy clothes on. It's not, you know, what we have, where you can walk around with a camera and take pictures at any particular time you want to. Some of the most powerful photography was done in wartime. For example, this is Sevastopol during the Crimean War. There are pictures from the American Civil War. And what these images do, really for the first time, is show the reality of war versus the glory of war. Wartime artists wanted to capture a hero on a horse. They wanted to capture the spirit of battle, trying to, like, glorifying, amplifying the reasons for killing, the reasons for violence in the name of God and country. What these wartime photographers were able to do was to present to your average person the horrors of war, the destruction of war. So here's a Crimean War trench after bombardment. You can imagine yourself being here as the bombs come down. If we then fast forward into the 20th century, this is what television news cameras do for us. And we have award-winning journalists who are able to tell the stories about what's going on in war, not just from a soldier's perspective, but from your average common victim of war. That type of storytelling came about in the mid-19th century with the advent of photography, as photography replaced storytelling in the eyes of the general public. Photography, then when you move into the 20th century, you get motion pictures.